Right, so here I am in Yorkshire Sculpture Park with the musician David Ashworth. And David's a guitarist and a composer, and he's recently found an inspiration from works of sculpture, particularly here at the Sculpture Park. So, hi Dave.
Hi Dave, thanks for inviting me along.
What is it about sculpture that inspires you to write music?
I think the sculptures, particularly ones in the open air, although they're a static lump as it were, there's a lot of implied movement and rhythm in the pieces. You can see in the sculpture behind us is Henry Moore, all the various curves and that implied dance and movement as you will. And actually, because of the way as a spectator you engage with the sculptures, you're able to walk around them, move close towards them, further away, because we've got all this space around us. Then there's movement there, which is sort of relates to the movement implicit in the sculpture itself. And then the other thing about the open air is you get the dynamic changing lighting conditions. So it looks different at different times of day. When the sun comes out, it brings light and shadows to the sculpture in different ways at different times of day. When it rains, they start to look more shiny, of course, and in fog it creates something completely different. So Goldsworthy is very keen to do practically all his work out of doors, because he likes to see the way that his sculptural forms relate with the changing light, and the way it's changing now as I speak.
That's
it's
right.
getting sunnier, and he sees galleries and museums as sort of dead spaces in some ways. He will do them occasionally, but not very often. He likes to do his stuff out of doors. Same with Hepworth. He's very keen. Her sculptures down in St Ives are mainly intended for her garden. A lot of her public works are set out of doors, so they pick up these changing lighting and weather conditions.
And this is such a beautiful park and such a lovely environment as well. It's interesting to see how the sculptures are placed to blend into the local environment, and how it's very much an organic thing, isn't it? The man-made structures among the natural world.
Absolutely. So I'm sure, had it not been for Yorkshire Sculpture Park, I would never have got into sculpture in the first place. Because in the past, sculpture has never done anything for me. I've seen them in art galleries and museums and just walked on by. But it's only seeing them in this sort of concept, in this sort of setting, that it starts to make sense to me, because you get the rhythms of nature, the rhythms of the landscape, sort of interacting in some ways with the rhythms of the sculptures, but with certain sculpture, that is. Yes.
Do you find musical ideas coming to you as you sit and look at the sculptures?
I think so, yes. As I say, the implied movement you get there, and then the various themes and motifs. You notice this particularly well with Henry Moore's work, where he will do what looks to be like the same sculpture many times over, but there's variations there, so you get like a theme and variations coming through. Particularly with the Hepworth family of man, which are set on a hill further over in the park. There's lots of musical resonances and ways you can musically respond directly in terms of layers of sound, textures, and different forms and the way they develop over time.
So here we are at the first of the Andy Goldsworthy sculptures. Dave, can you tell me about this first one?
Yeah, hanging trees, it's all to do with boundaries. We've got this boundary wall here, and on one side we've got the country estate, Bretton Hall originally, and then on the other side it's farmland. And it's to do with the conflicts and tensions that boundary walls create between two different cultures, I suppose. You've got the agriculture on one side, and then the 19th century stately home, 18th, 19th century stately home culture on the other. And the tensions that are reflected in that. Now, boundary walls do two things. They keep animals out on this side, and they keep animals in on the other side. And it's a dynamic thing. They're always changing, because these walls take some constructing. And this is a special wall because it's built in a sunken ditch, so it wouldn't be visible from the house. It's what's known as a ha-ha. So the illusion from the house is that the landscape just gradually morphs from the parkland into the farmland, if you
right,
like.
so it doesn't interrupt the the flow of the landscape when you're observing it from a distance.
That's
with,
right, yes. Something that
man-made
would have
structures.
been appreciated by painters of the picturesque who want to create these artificial but very natural, pretty looking scenes. And but what Goldsworthy makes us realise with this, although it's to do with aesthetics and prettiness, a lot of hard work goes into building these things in the first place. And he'd be very conscious of this because his background as a young person, as a farm labourer, he'd be very conscious of just how hard the work is on a farm and how unromantic it is. And so on this sculpture, a lot of hard work will go into building this. These things don't come about by themselves. So a lot of heavy-duty building equipment, huge cranes lifting these enormous oak tree trunks in, and then these really deep walls would take a lot of time and effort in building. And one of the points he makes is that when, as a farm labourer and also as a sculptor of the outdoors, he gets to an understanding of how the countryside works through just interacting with it and spending time in it and developing his sculptures with it. And so the understanding comes through work, through doing things over a long time period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but can you tell me about what's the significance of the oak tree that's so much a part of the sculpture?
Yeah, a lot of Goldsworthy's sculptures are to do with the interaction between wood and stone, which he sees as mirroring the conflict between the two cultures, the sort of human culture I referred to earlier. Because what happens when you build a wall, you often have to fell trees, you have to clear trees and scrubland to build the wall. But then having built the wall, over time, the roots of trees can gradually bring the walls down. So there's a constant battle going on between trees and stones, and reflects in a lot of his sculptures. I've done some projects in the past on his sheepfold sculptures over in Cumbria, and a lot of it's to do with wood and stone there. So what he's done here, he's taken these three oak trees, which were found on different parts of the estate. I think they were fallen down anyway, and he's cut them down and had them transported over here. And the cranes have lowered them into the pit and put them horizontally rather than vertically. So you get the idea that the tree trunks are flowing, as it were. So although they're actually dead material, they're done to represent living, flowing things, a bit like streams and the tributaries. And the fact that they're embedded into the wall in this way gives the illusion that they go on flowing from one chamber to the next.
Yes, it almost looks as though they could be the roots of a much larger tree some distance away,
Yes, absolutely. It's as though it's an underground network going on. And because the tree trunks are sort of suspended here, there's a tension there because the weight of that wood being supported by this wall. And the walls also offer protection to the wood as well, because no animals or people can get at that wood. And so, although it will decay through natural forces over time. It's interesting, before we were talking, an elderly couple came along here, and they were saying they've been watching this tree over time. They come back every year and look at it and notice the subtle changes that take part in the wood over that time.
That's great, isn't it? That's presumably what Goldsworthy would have wanted people to do. To
Absolutely,
keep coming
yes.
and seeing the changes. It's an organic, changing structure. It's not a static piece of work like a hard granite sculpture.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
And also, although in a sense that the chamber does offer some protection to the wood, it's not lying on the ground or the damp where it would decay much more rapidly. It's not getting overgrown by things. But nevertheless, the wood is slowly rotting, and they pointed out that there's little mushrooms starting to grow on the wood now, and there's moss in certain areas as well. So it is a sculpture which will change over time. And although it's a very simple looking thing, it's just a branch, suspended in a wall, the more you look at it, the more you start thinking about it, there's lots of resonances there which get you thinking of all sorts of different things and all sorts of different levels, really.
Yeah, a funny image that came to me, and this is probably because of my medical background, is it almost reminds me of when a surgeon during an operation exposes an artery, which is going all the way through the body, and we're just seeing this little section of it.
Yes. It's as though we're getting a glimpse into an underworld, really, isn't it, I suppose? Yeah. Yes, it's like a cutaway cross-section in some ways.
How did you go about expressing your feelings about this piece in the music that you wrote?
Yeah, it's awfully hard to explain. I mean, one of the reasons I do it through music is it saves having to articulate it in words or conscious thoughts. So, I mean, the whole site just leapt out at me for two reasons as a basis for a musical piece. One is, it is in a sense like a graphic score laid out. You've got 3 chambers where there's action happening and then connecting walls. So it's a bit like Mussorgsky's pictures as an exhibition, I suppose. You promenade from one picture to the next. And the 3 chambers are related in some way, I think, because you've got sort of rhythm and movement implied by the way the wood flows through and into the stone. And so that gave me the idea for working with it musically. And then it was really just a question of thinking about what's going on here in terms of the tension between cultures, the human cultures on both sides of the wall, the tension between the stone and the wood, and sort of thinking almost subliminally about that. And then when it came to the music, just letting the instruments do the talking, really, and see what came out of it. I mean, at a very basic level, I was conscious that in the music for the chambers, I wanted to epitomise the struggle that's going on there between the cultures and between the wood and the stone. So they're fairly rhythmic, fairly pounding, insistent, aggressive conflicts going on. And then you get the contrast between the walls connecting them, where the music's much calmer altogether. And in a sense, that reflects the calmness of the cultured estate, the manicured estate behind us. Very sophisticated, cultured, 19th century aesthetic, I suppose. And then the chambers, the harder, harsher world of reality of the farming life, I suppose. Yeah, what's interesting is we move from that chamber down at the end and then move on to the second one. You look down again, you do get the illusion that the branches have flowed seamlessly from that first chamber and come out in this second chamber. The other thing that strikes me is the contrast between the rigid, man-made, geometric structures of these chambers and the walls, as opposed to the more flowing, dynamic, organic way the wood develops and moves over time. It's a much more sinuous, musically flowing thing. And I like to think the music reflects that in some ways.
So now we're at the third of the 3 sculptures.
And what's interesting, the first time I walked past these, the 3 chambers look more or less identical. Just a sunken tree trunk surrounded by 4 walls. But as you spend more time looking at them, you realise there are subtle differences. And this third and final chamber, there's more going on. There's much more wood here, branches going at different angles, so there's more activity. And I reflect that in the piece of music, in that final section. There are more layers of sound going on, exploring the complexity of the different layers moving in more different directions. We also notice with this chamber that nature's starting to fight back, and we can see plants are starting to overgrow and crowd onto the wall on that side. And the bit of connecting wall between here and the second chamber They're starting to bulge in places where the trees on that right-hand side are starting to push against the wall. And so it's only a matter of time, we feel, it could be some considerable time, before these chambers in these walls become deformed in some ways as nature fights back.
Yes, it's rather as though, you know, these works of art as they decay are gradually turning into archaeology.
Yes, it's ephemeral, so it's a dynamic process, and he would want that. I think the last thing he would want would be for workmen to come and conserve and rebuild this and restore it in some way, in the way we do with buildings like our cathedrals, for instance. He would want natural processes and decay to be part of the process. So there's a sort of rhythm, and a dynamic rhythm over time, and it may be long periods of time, but eventually there will be the changes and decay are part of the living sculpture.